We now look at consequentialism. We'll look at it very broadly with an introduction to consequentialism itself, like what is it? And then we'll look at two particular versions of it. One very narrow consequentialism, perhaps the narrowest of all, ethical egoism, and then a broader one called utilitarianism. So consequentialism is a general view that's not necessarily limited to ethics. One can be a consequentialist in areas of money, for example. If you're in business trying to make the most money, you're kind of a consequentialist about money. So what is consequentialism? Well, the idea is this. If you're a consequentialist, you would assess actions in terms of their consequences for the relevant beings. So the way you do an assessment is, okay, if I do this, then what effect does it have on those that matter? So in this view, going back to our intrinsic versus extrinsic approach to value, for the consequentialist, actions have extrinsic value. So no action by itself is inherently, positive or negative in value. It's all a matter of the consequences it generates. And as I noted earlier, a consequentialist theory or principle doesn't have to be limited to morality, to what we think of as ethics. Although economics is part of ethics, we generally don't think of it as such. So a person in business could be aiming at maximizing their profit, and this we would tend to think would not be like a matter of moral assessment. It would be a matter of money assessment. And so for a consequentialist, the idea is you're trying to maximize what is of value. So a preferable action is one that does this maximization, generates the most positive value. Now, this is a general category which encompasses other theories, and our concern here is with moral theories, and these include ethical egoism and utilitarianism. This is considered to be a teleological approach, and because the value is assessed in terms of outcomes, in terms of ends or goals. So for the consequentialist, the actions are means to the end of achieving those consequences. So consequentialists of all varieties have to address two broad questions. One is the question of value. What is the value that is supposed to be maximized? How are we keeping score in this, this assessment? And examples could include, like in business, profit. It could be pleasure, could be happiness, could be desires. It could be anything that could be maximized. Although obviously it would start getting, kind of odd if one kind of silly example I remember from grad school was about someone who was a consequentialist who wanted to maximize the number of purple things in the universe. Technically a consequentialist, but somewhat unusual. Secondly, consequentialists have to address the matter of relevant beings. That's to say, who counts? When you're assessing the consequences of actions and deciding, is it, creating the maximal positive value for those who matter, the question here is who counts? And this can range from a very narrow scope, which would be, in my case, like me. You'll see this with ethical egoism. And so I would look at everything in terms of what maximizes value for me. And of course, presumably the narrowest scope would be at 0, which would be nobody. And of course, you could expand this more and more, going beyond, like in my case, just beyond me to might extend it to other people, like people I care about, or I could extend it very broadly. And in theory, this could extend to everything. It could be in theory infinite. So why do people find consequentialism appealing? Well, one kind of obvious thing is that if you ask people, hey, would you like more or less of what you consider valuable? So if you ask somebody who values money, you said, hey, would you like more money or less money? People would tend to say like more money. And if someone valued, happiness, they would typically want more happiness. Now, of course, there can be kind of like, Twilight Zone style scenarios where Someone could value something, but they wouldn't want more of it because it would become like terrible, getting too much, kind of a, horror story scenario. But in general, people tend to want more of what they value. Also, when people are being maybe rational, they tend to consider consequences of actions. They would think, okay, if I do this, what is the likely result? So the whole, consequences does seem, plausible and appealing. And of course, if you look at people, we tend to assess things in terms of who's relevant and who's not. We tend to vary. Some people, laying aside, ethics, would be very selfish, caring about themselves only. Other people would extend it more, and some people would extend it very broadly, maybe to all, human beings, or maybe even beyond to like all living creatures, or maybe way beyond to everything. So that's a basic introduction to consequentialism, looked at very broadly. And next we'll head on to looking at a particular form of consequentialism known as ethical egoism. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.